Please come home now. She's beating your mother." The billionaire froze at what he saw. Michael Carter was closing a $100 million deal when his phone rang. It was Sarah, his housekeeper. Her voice was shaking. "Please come home now," she whispered. "She's beating your mother." He didn't say a word. He just stood up, walked out of the boardroom, and left everyone staring. No one in that room knew what he was about to walk into. And no one, not even Michael, knew how much his life was about to change. Michael had built his fortune from nothing. He grew up in a small house on Maple Street, raised by his mother, Grace, after his father left. Grace worked 2 jobs so Michael could go to college. She never asked for anything in return. When Michael became successful, he bought her a beautiful room in his mansion, hired the best care, and told everyone she was the reason for everything he had. Grace was 78 now. Gentle. Soft-spoken. She still kept an old coffee mug from their first apartment, chipped on the handle, sitting on her nightstand like a trophy. She still called Michael my boy, even in front of his business partners. Sarah had worked for the family for 3 years. She adored Grace. Every morning, she'd bring her tea and sit with her for a few minutes before starting her chores. But lately, something had changed. Grace seemed quieter, thinner. She flinched when footsteps came down the hallway. Michael's wife, Vanessa, had married him 2 years earlier. She was charming in public, elegant dresses, perfect smile, always the center of attention at Michael's events. But behind closed doors, she resented Grace. She thought the old woman took up too much space, too much of Michael's time, too much of his money. Sarah noticed small things first. A bruise on Grace's wrist, hidden under a sleeve. Grace eating dinner alone in her room instead of with the family. One evening, Sarah heard raised voices coming from Grace's room, and then silence. A silence that felt wrong. But then something unexpected happened. Sarah walked past the door and saw Vanessa gripping Grace's arm, hissing something Sarah couldn't hear. Grace's eyes were wet. When Vanessa noticed Sarah, she smiled sweetly and said, "Just helping her to bed." Sarah nodded and walked away. But her hands were shaking. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept replaying Grace's face, not angry, not confused. Scared. The next morning, she brought Grace her tea like always. Grace's wrist was wrapped in a scarf, even though it wasn't cold. "Are you all right?" Sarah asked gently. Grace looked at the door, then back at Sarah, and said only, "Don't tell Michael. Please." Sarah promised. But a promise like that sits heavy on a person's chest. Over the next 2 weeks, things grew worse. Vanessa began controlling everything. What Grace ate, when she could leave her room, even who she was allowed to talk to. She told the staff that Grace was confused and needed rest, which gave her an excuse to keep her isolated. Grace stopped smiling. She stopped mentioning her old apartment. She stopped being herself. Sarah tried to tell Michael once, in passing, that Grace seemed unwell. Michael, buried in work, told her to make sure Grace saw a doctor and left it at that. He trusted Vanessa completely. He had no reason not to. Then, one afternoon, Sarah found something that changed everything. Tucked beneath Grace's mattress was a small notebook. Inside, in shaky handwriting, Grace had been writing down dates. Times. Short, quiet sentences like, "She said I embarrass him. She took my medicine bag as punishment. I don't want to be a burden." Sarah's hands trembled as she read page after page. She didn't understand all of it yet. But she understood enough to know Grace had been suffering in silence for months. That evening, Sarah heard Vanessa's voice again, sharper than before, coming from Grace's room. She rushed to the door and saw Grace flinching, her arm raised to protect herself. Sarah didn't think. She pulled out her phone and called Michael. "Please come home now," she said, her voice breaking. "She's beating your mother." Michael drove faster than he ever had in his life. When he walked through his front door, the house was silent. Staff stood frozen in the hallway, afraid to speak. He found Vanessa at the top of the stairs, calm, composed, already rehearsing an explanation. But Michael didn't look at her. He looked past her, toward his mother's room. Grace was sitting quietly, her eyes red, her hands folded in her lap like she was trying to disappear. When she saw Michael, she tried to smile, the way she always did to protect him from worry. But this time, Michael saw through it. He knelt beside her and took her hands. "Mom," he whispered, "why didn't you tell me?" Grace's voice cracked. "I didn't want to lose you too." That single sentence undid him completely. Sarah stepped forward and handed Michael the notebook, her hand still shaking. He read it standing right there in the hallway, his jaw tightening with every page. Months of quiet suffering, written in his mother's careful, trembling handwriting. When he finished, he looked up at Vanessa, who was still trying to explain, still trying to smile. "Get out," he said quietly. "Tonight." Vanessa's confidence cracked for the first time. She reached for excuses, for sympathy, for anything that might change his mind. But Michael had already made his decision. Some betrayals don't need a courtroom. They only need the truth, spoken once, clearly. In the weeks that followed, Michael moved his mother into the sunniest room in the house, the one with the garden view she'd always admired. He hired a nurse who treated her like family, not a task. Every morning, he made time for tea with her himself, no matter how busy his schedule was. He framed the old chipped coffee mug and placed it on a shelf where Grace could see it every day, a reminder of where they came from and how far they'd traveled together. Sarah stayed on, and Grace began calling her family. Grace's laughter slowly returned. She started telling stories again, about Maple Street, about the 2 jobs, about the boy who grew up to build an empire but never forgot who raised him. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, Grace squeezed Michael's hand and said, "You always were listening, even when I thought no one was." Michael smiled, eyes glistening. "I heard you, Mom. I just needed someone brave enough to make me listen." Sometimes the smallest act of courage becomes the loudest act of love. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still believes kindness can change the world. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment below.